Body-wise perfect size is delighted to speak with Virgie Tovar. Can you tell me how you became a fat revolutionary?
I, in some ways, I think the story began with the beginning of my life. The very beginning, I was a fat baby. My mother was a fat mom, and it's interesting talking to her now. She didn't really have this scare epidemic rhetoric she was dealing with during her pregnancy. She never talked about being told that she was at risk or I was at risk. And she was, I think, 350 pounds during her pregnancy. And so it's really interesting watching that shift happen from the 80s to now, where women, are terrorized before, if they're pregnant or they're thinking about being pregnant and they're fat. Anyway, but she was a fat mom. I was a fat baby. And that kind of that set the scene in a lot of ways, because I was born into a country that was on the verge of deciding that it was having an obesity epidemic. And that became the backdrop of the story. As a child, before I was introduced to school, I was fairly sheltered from fat phobia. I was allowed to eat whatever I wanted. I was never really told that I needed to stop eating, or my eating wasn't pathologized. And then at primary school, I sort of identify as like this systematic emotional terrorism, whatever you want to call it, like this systematic emotional process of breaking my identity and sense of self down, which is what fat phobia does. And, at first I remember, resisting it in a lot of ways. And then finally kind of giving in, because when everybody's telling you the same thing, your brain just works in a way where it just sort of a lot of times thinks, okay, these people are probably right. This is the logical truth or whatever. And that went on for years and years. I was a weight cycler. And I think more importantly, I was on the road to something incredibly dangerous. And because I was fat, that was utterly invisible to everyone, my parents, my friends, my teachers, everyone. I was absolutely engaging in starving behavior. I was starving myself to the point of getting ill. Like I couldn't stand up. I had scurvy, essentially. I had disorientation, like severe loss of equilibrium, such that I couldn't stand up for more than a couple of minutes because I felt like I was going to become very sick. It's hard for me now to even identify that period as anorexic style behavior, because I never was that model of an anorexic. The weight cycling, the starvation behavior went on for many years and just kind of exacerbated.
So, Virgie, what was the turning point for you?
I was introduced to feminism when I was 21 years old, and that really changed my life. And I was in college. I was at a very liberal school, and just these group of like ragtag hairy ladies kind of just changed my world. And they kind of taught me that I, as a woman, could have a life on my own terms. And if you can imagine, I'm 21, something like that. And I'd never heard this before. It was an incredible healing experience. And I think that in a lot of ways, that experience of feminism and some of the men I dated around that time, who kind of told me that I was beautiful, who told me that I was sexy. And like, that's not, I mean, being told you're beautiful and sexy isn't always necessarily a revolutionary thing, but sometimes it can be like the linchpin for a very important realization about who you are in the world. It's funny because people were reading me as political and like a revolutionary before I even identified as one, because I always was wearing tight clothes and fairly bright colors. I've always been drawn to really gaudy kind of costume-ish. At the time, it just felt like I was coming into my sexuality for the first time ever, having had my sexuality denied, repressed, and bullied out of me for years and years. And then, at 18, finding that actually men did love me. Actually, it wasn't hard for me to find love or sex or relationships. All the things that I'd been told I couldn't have were actually right there. So I remember I think like 25, 26, and a friend of mine was in graduate school, and she asked me to write a story for her master's project. It was about body image, and she said, why don't you write about being fat? You talk about it all the time. And I didn't even entirely realize that I was using that kind of phraseology, but but I was. And so I'm like, sure, I'll do it. So I sit down to write an essay, and it ends up being called Fatties of the World Unite. So it's like this total, like, I mean, it's this aggressive manifesto, like very almost like 60s feminist style listing of all of the injustices, and just kind of being honest about the kind of like particular way in which fat women who walk through the world, like what we have to deal with every single day. And I found that piece had such incredible emotional resonance. And this was, I think, like 2009. The emotional resonance was just incredible from people. And I started to think, is this something that people need to hear from me? And then it's kind of like, I'm from California. I'm woo, as they say. I believe in the magic of the universe. And I remember asking, I was like, universe, what am I doing with my life? And like the universe like delivered this message to me that like I needed to become part of this movement, right? It just kind of unfolded in this like really unexpectedly organic way. Like I began to research fat women, and I just kind of went down the rabbit hole of body politics. And I was lucky enough to have this like rich social scientific education such that I could really begin to analyze the complexity of this issue and see how far its root system goes down. And to be honest, it goes incredibly deep. It's a historical system based in the subjugation of women, based in the control of people's lives, and I feel very lucky that I was trained to understand it, to decode it.
Not only were you trained to decode it, but you've also written a fabulous book on it.
Yeah, so Hot and Heavy, Fierce Fat Girls on Life, Love, and Fashion is an anthology. I mean, I asked 31 women to tell me the story of how they essentially learned to survive body-hating culture. Like, how did they decide to leave diet culture behind? Was kind of the story that I was asking them. The stories I got were just incredible. They covered themes like motherhood, dating, sex work, being a porn star, fashion. Just, I mean, it's incredible. And I want to tell you about one of the first stories that I heard was by a writer and burlesque performer in Seattle, and her name is Cherry Tart. I said, what's your story? Like, how did you get to this point where we're hanging out with a bunch of fat girls in bikinis at a pool? Like, how did you get here? She said, well, and this is the first chapter in the book. I was in a really terrible car accident. My car was completely totaled. I didn't have any airbags. Like a truck was coming in one direction, she was coming in another, and this truck just rammed into her. So the car is completely totaled, and she got airlifted out of the car, taken to the hospital. The doctor says, if you hadn't been fat, you'd be dead. Like your belly actually saved your life because you didn't have an airbag, and it acted as like a buffer that protected your internal organs. So thank God you were carrying extra weight. And she said, after that point, I just couldn't hate my body anymore. It had saved my life. I've heard a number of narratives like this where fatness actually helps people live longer or helps them go through like cancer treatment. There's a lot of stories like that never get told, of course, because they're against the narrative that fat kills you all the time. And the work of the book is to support people who want to make that transition from, self-loathing to self-loving, to self-love. And I think that it was incredibly important to me to make it an anthology. I thought about writing just a single author piece, and I felt like people would read the book and think, oh, she's just some magical unicorn. She had some amazing gene that like helped her be this person. That can't be me. And I think that when you're reading 31 women tell the story of how they did this thing, it's easier to imagine that you can do it too. So it was incredibly important. The book is just full of like really touching, really incredible stories, very, very personal stories of women who just wanted to share, what it was that turned their life around, and they decided to stop obeying diet culture and just live their life on their own terms.
What could I expect if I went to one of your workshops?
my oversharing style, like ranting personality just immediately is like, oh my God, she's the weirdest person in the room. So I can just be my weird self, and I will not even be like the third weirdest person here, or certainly not the second. So I think that that's something that I offer that's a little bit unique. But I think like more so, I'm extremely dedicated to equipping women. I work with women almost exclusively, having people who work with me leave with tools. My goal is to just kind of, have like put a pen in your hand, put a sword in your hand, whatever. Like I just kind of really want people to leave feeling empowered to take control of their life. Very important for me. Every time I do a talk, I talk about diet culture as a system of control, as a system of limiting lives. I feel like they leave with this understanding of exactly how sinister this system is and how they can begin to disentangle themselves from it.
You're also going to be part of a documentary.
There's a documentary coming out called Fatitude the movie, and it was two women are making this film, and it's about essentially the treatment of bodies and fat bodies in particular in media. So it's a very specific examination of how media play a role in how we experience ourselves as fat people, and how we as a culture are being taught to think of our bodies and the bodies of others. One of the things that they asked me about was the show Drop Dead Diva. The premise is that the main character is a fat woman, but she's actually a thin woman who died and then ended up being reincarnated in the body of a fat woman. And so she's trying to like learn to live her life. And it's like absurd, right? Like I think like this only makes sense kind of in the United States context because it's just so absurd. And it says so much about like how we're taught to think of women. But it's like the whole point is that you have this sympathetic feeling for this poor thin woman who's been subjugated to like living in a fat body, but you can still root for her because she's actually secretly thin. She just happens to be cursed in this fat body. And so you're kind of like rooting for her. She has to deal with all these things that fat girls have to deal with, but you don't have to feel guilty because you're not actually rooting for a fat person. You're rooting for a skinny person. And somehow she becomes ultimately glorified, ultimately moral, perhaps more moral than she ever could be as a thin person because she has to live this life in this body. And so I end up kind of doing this analysis of this show, which is just so absurd, and kind of like what that says, like what that tells people about fatness and how fat women don't deserve to be alive unless there's secretly a thin woman inside of them that's like taken over their bodies, and like how just sick that is. But that's just one of the many highlights of the film.
You can find out more about the fabulous Virgie at virgietovar.com.